The environment can affect how well photosynthesis, the light reactions, and the Calvin cycle occur. And probably the most obvious one is the amount of light or light intensity. Light color we've talked a lot about. Temperature can also affect photosynthetic efficiency. So remember that warmer temperatures increase enzyme activity, and so to a certain point, warm temperatures will increase photosynthesis. And then the third factor here is water availability. So remember, water is directly required for photosynthesis. So without water, plants are not going to be able to effectively carry out photosynthesis. So plants have had to deal with these environmental conditions in specific ways, and so we're going to focus on one specific adaptation that plants have. To understand this adaptation, we need to come back to the Calvin cycle. So remember, the first step of the Calvin cycle is to take CO2 and combine it with ribulose bisphosphate and then produce 2 3-carbon molecules. So 2 of these. Right? And then that initiates the Calvin cycle, where we'll eventually, in a series of steps, produce 2 G3Ps. So that's what normally happens. And so most plants are C3 plants, and that's exactly how they carry out the Calvin cycle with no extra steps. However, there's a problem that arises for C3 plants. This chemical reaction is carried out by an enzyme called rubisco. And remember that enzymes have active sites. And those active sites are supposed to be specific enough for the substrate. So CO2 is one of the critical substrates here. In rubisco, the active site is not as specific as it could be. So it can also fit oxygen. So rubisco will take oxygen and add it on to ribulose bisphosphate. And if it does that, it will actually release CO2. So remember, photosynthesis normally captures or fixes CO2 and turns it into sugars. This will actually break down sugars and release CO2. This is called photorespiration, and it's wasteful. It reduces photosynthetic output for the plant, so it's not good for the plant. So why would this sometimes happen more than other times? Well, it's going to tend to occur more when there's high oxygen and low CO2. Because again, remember, the CO2 has to get into the active site. As long as there's a lot of CO2, CO2 will mainly get into the active site. But if I start to have high O2, then O2 will get into the active site instead. So high O2 and low CO2 will create more photorespiration. And remember, this means less photosynthesis. So it's not good for the plant. So why would this occur in the plant? It has to do with stomata. So remember those pores that let gas in and out in the leaf? Stomata will close in hot, dry conditions. So why do they close in hot, dry conditions? Because they're trying to hold in water. Because if it's hot and dry, the water will tend to evaporate out of the leaves. So the stomata close up to hold in that water vapor, but the byproduct of that is that they also hold in gases. So now O2 starts to build up as it's produced by photosynthesis, and CO2 starts to decrease because it's being used by photosynthesis. And so when the stomata are closed, this is what will tend to occur. So because of this photorespiration, there are plants that live in hot, dry climates that have had to adapt to reduce photorespiration. These plants are called C4 plants. They get this name because they have an extra step. And the extra step produces a 4-carbon compound from CO2. So before the Calvin cycle, there's this extra step where it takes CO2 and adds it onto a 3-carbon molecule. And when you do that, it makes a 4-carbon molecule. this 4-carbon molecule can then later be broken down into a 3-carbon molecule and CO2. So now this chemical reaction makes CO2 rather than pulling it directly out of the atmosphere. So how does this help the plant deal with photorespiration? Well, it's going to organize the tissues in such a way that it has certain cells that have stomata that are carrying out this part of it. So CO2 comes into the mesophyll cells and is fixed into the 4-carbon molecule. The bundle sheath cells then carry out the reverse reaction. And then also in the bundle sheath cells, the CO2 can go into the Calvin cycle. So this is a benefit because having this reaction produce the CO2 here in the bundle sheath cells keeps CO2 high, even when the stomata are closed. By keeping CO2 high, I will keep photorespiration low. And again, remember, the photorespiration is bad for the plant, so keeping it low is what it wants to do. So this is what this looks like in a little more detail. You have the leaf structure. You have the mesophyll cells on the outside exposed to air. So these ones here, and they have air exchange. The bundle sheath cells are here, a deeper in, and so they're not exposed to air. So their source of CO2 is going to be the chemical reaction. So here in the mesophyll cells, CO2 comes in and it makes the 4-carbon molecule. The 4-carbon molecule then goes into the bundle sheath cells where it's broken down into the 3-carbon molecule and CO2. The CO2 then goes into the Calvin cycle, also in the bundle sheath cells. So again, this keeps CO2 high in the bundle sheath cells. So this might have high O2, but it's using a different chemical reaction that doesn't bind it, just because its active site is more specific than Rubisco. Okay. So you might be wondering which is better, to be C3 or C4. Well, it really depends on where you live. If it's a plant that lives in hot, dry climates, then being C4 is great because it is going to reduce photorespiration. But if the plant lives in cooler climates, this is actually negative because it costs ATP. So unless I really need this feature, I don't want to be spending that ATP. So C3 plants, our regular plants, will use less energy and as long as they're in cooler climates. And the majority of plants, 90% of plants, are C3 plants. So a very similar adaptation is the one that occurs in CAM plants. CAM, C-A-M, stands for crassulacean acid metabolism. Instead of separating based on 2 types of cells, CAM plants are on a day-night schedule. So they do something really similar. At night, they open their stomata, so that allows CO2 to come in, combines it with the 3-carbon molecule, and makes a 4-carbon molecule. During the day, it then closes its stomata, but then it breaks down that 4-carbon molecule to produce CO2. And then it goes into the Calvin cycle, which, remember, the Calvin cycle will only be occurring during the day because that's when the light reactions are occurring. So these are the CAM and C4 plants next to each other. So in the C4, remember, we have the mesophyll cells where the CO2 is fixed into the 4-carbon molecule. The 4-carbon molecule goes to the bundle sheath cells and then is broken down to release CO2. The CO2 feeds into the Calvin cycle. CAM is very similar, but they don't have 2 cell types. It's the same cell. But during the night, they bring in CO2 and make the 4-carbon molecule. And then during the daytime, they take the 4-carbon molecule, break it down into CO2, put that CO2 into the Calvin cycle, and make sugars. So cacti are a good example of a CAM, or crassulucian acid metabolism plant, that does this. So if a climate became much hotter and drier, which kind of species would you expect to do better there? Hopefully you realize that C4 and CAM plants would do better in hot, dry environments, whereas C3 plants are going to do better in cooler environments. Doesn't mean that you can't have C3 plants in warm environments. It's just that there'll be an advantage to being C4 or CAM for some plants.